Thank you, everyone who's tuning back in. And I'd just like to start this video with the same question that was asked to me that I mentioned in the last video, which is simply, who are you? And so, if you just want to take a moment to jot down an answer to that question, maybe it'll take a little more than a moment, then feel free to do that. To pause the video and do that. And if you're having some trouble answering it, then two other questions that I think can help you get something down on the paper are, how do you want to be seen by others? Or how do you think others see you? And so if you just want to take a minute and write something down, that would be great. But I'm really excited to be sharing with you what I'm about to share with you, which is, how did we get to this place? How did we get to this place where we really lack identity, where we're so lost? So lost. Not like the show, but it can feel like that, just lost and stranded and not knowing who we are. And I posit to you that what's brought us to this place is sin. And before you're like, oh, yeah, of course, let me just kind of lay out a scenario here. We learned from Adam and Eve that their actions brought sin into the world. Now, sin has had some terrible consequences, one of which is that it's corrupted humanity. It's made our lives as human beings lives of corruption. A lot of the things we do, pretty much anything we do, which is under the guise of sin, ends up being destructive. And so sin has it's caused us to rebel against God with our minds, our hearts, our bodies. It's separated us from God. And what we see in the Old Testament, this is the real problem with sin, is that our efforts to live a pure and sinless life without doing harm to others, without harming ourselves, it all ends in failure. It was impossible for the Israelites, who were people who were chosen by God, to do it on their own, because sin is ingrained in what I would term the fallen man. And so the identity that we have without the intervention of God has just this insatiable hunger for sin. And what this does is it keeps us in this perpetual cycle of thoughts and actions that are just not good for us. They're not good for others. And in fact, the alienation of sin is threefold. We're alienated from God because sin separates us from God. We're alienated from ourselves because we don't know who we are. And we're alienated from each other because since we don't know who we are, we have trouble connecting to others. And I mentioned in the last video just the dire state of the mental health of the American people. And one of the things that has resulted from this trend over the past, half century of the deteriorating health of the American people has been such a huge emphasis on psychology. And it's really grown as just this huge area of study now. I know my father has a couple psychology degrees, but most people say there's no money in psychology. So why is it so popular? It's because people want to know how our minds work and who we are. If we can figure out how we think, then maybe we'll know how we act, why we act certain ways, and who we are. And in essence, psychology examines how we think, why we think that way, and how our thinking affects our actions. Now, our sin is a result of acting out of a false self or a false belief system. So, really, what it is that we're acting out of illusions. We're not living in a true reality. We're forming a false reality based off false beliefs. And this leads us to think we are different than we actually are. One of these beliefs, authors like Henry Newland would call it the illusion of immortality. And so, what the illusion of immortality is a person attaching who they are or their value as a human being to either their possessions, their social connections, or their accomplishments. Ironically enough, those three things are probably the top three things that people use to assess what their identity is. If you took the time to write down who you are, just look at the list of things you may have written and see if any of them are involving your possessions, your social connections, or your accomplishments. And so the fallen man clings to these illusions because in the person's mind, there are times where it's more bearable to live in this illusion than in actual reality. And that's really evident, especially if we see like the issues with drug abuse or alcohol abuse in society, that there's something that draws people when it comes to living in an illusion, even if it's just temporary, rather than living in reality. And so the consequence is that the fallen man creates this false reality based on illusion rather than walking in true identity. Now, a couple other things I just want to mention before ending this video is that there are some awful side effects to living from this place, from living as a person um, who is fallen. First, we, as a fallen person, you can't confront or heal from the pains of the past because you're not really willing or able to acknowledge your own brokenness. You're not able to see how disconnected you are from others, how disconnected you are from yourself, how disconnected you are from God. And the man's sense of self deteriorates. You have no self awareness, and you also project yourself onto others in a negative way. And now, the danger of crafting an identity around subjectively interpreted life events, which is what the fallen man does, is that the individual's identity is not stable. It goes with the wind. One situation can completely change how you see yourself. That's the issue with the fallen man. Now, who is the fallen man? It's all of us. It's you. It's me. Men and women alike. Our minds, lacking the spiritual truth, have now entrapped us in the experiences of life. Brokenness, woundedness, loneliness, hostility, illusions, fear, anxiety, helplessness. So many symptoms of a mind that thinks and acts as a fallen man are present in our everyday lives. And this all points to a single truth. We have fallen short of our potential and who we've been created to be. It's a truth that the fallen man is unwilling to accept. Now, as stated earlier, the false self prefers illusion to reality. The false self is rebellious. It refuses to acknowledge a need for God. So the fallen man psychology is a self-rejecting psychology. It rejects the reality of who we are by avoiding confrontation with the negative ramifications that have come from our own flawed thinking and that was independent of God. It's a vicious cycle. It's self-seeking, self-absorbed, and self-destructive. The mind of the fallen man refuses to acknowledge its need to be saved from itself. To illustrate, have you ever seen someone that's swimming but they're not really swimming. They're really drowning, but they call it swimming. And you can see they're actually starting to drown. And so what happens is a lifeguard goes to save them. But when they get on the surfboard of the lifeguard, they're like, "Why'd you save me? I was doing completely fine." That's the false self, the fallen man syndrome, the "I can do it myself" mentality. I can do everything myself. I don't need anyone. The mind of the fallen man refuses to acknowledge its need to be saved from itself. The fallen man's identity is physical in nature. It's unable to cross the spiritual chasm that produces thoughts and actions that are life giving. I know I've said a lot here and a lot of negative, because a lot of negative is associated with the fallen man. What I'm trying to do is show that there's a problem. There's a problem that needs an answer. From the beginning, we've been stuck in this place where sin has corrupted us to the point that we just do things that aren't actually helpful to us or to others. But it's a place we all want to be, is where we feel connected with each other, unified and one. But this huge chasm exists. There's a huge gap, and it's a spiritual gap because sin has separated us from God, which is why when we look at most faiths, there is a notion and concept of God involved, or gods. There's a concept of a higher being, because we understand that there's a spiritual aspect of our lives which has a void in it. And so to have a chance to cross this chasm, we needed a bridge. We needed someone to bridge us from physical to spiritual. And that's what I'm going to be talking about in the next video. And so thank you for taking the time to listen. I hope you got something out of this. And yeah, please stay with me for the next one. Let's get through these next couple videos together. And I really believe that it'll give you a greater appreciation for life, a greater appreciation for God, and will encourage you to really press into understanding everything that we have access to as human beings, everything that we were meant to be and that we are meant to be.